can see that there's some people that have already joined. I just started about a minute early because there's a lot of people that are coming in today, so I just wanted to give everybody a chance to make their way in. So we'll get started probably 30 seconds or so after 12. Okay, so I think there's a good number of people here, so I'm just going to get started with introductions and such, just so that we can kind of get into this. And because it's recorded, if anybody's a little bit late coming in, they'll still receive the recorded copy of this afterwards. So hi everybody, my name is Sophie and I'm part of the customer success team here at Umapped. We're so happy that you've registered and joined us for our summer school series, and we thank you for taking the time to join us today for part 2 of this 5-part series. Each week for the month of July, we'll build on what we've learned during the previous sessions, and at the end of the month, you'll walk away with confidence that you are leveraging all of Umapped's functionality to streamline your workflow and meet your business and customer needs, and content-rich profiles, templates, and trips so that you're ready to inspire your clients as they dream and plan for future travel. During today's session, we'll be demonstrating how you can leverage the Umapped vendor database to manage, customize, and even create profiles for your preferred hotel, cruise, and tour/activity partners. We'll be showing you how to add content, descriptions, and photos to your profiles to help enrich your customer's experience. We'll also provide details on how you can take advantage of our one-time CSV upload option for all of your existing vendors. As always, we'll leave some time for a Q&A at the end of today's session, but feel free to leave your questions as I talk in the Q&A section. I do have my colleague Barry from the customer success team here as well, who will be answering questions in the Q&A section while I talk. So, you can either wait till the very end if you want a demo, since I'm the one that's sharing my screen, or if you just have some questions about information, Barry will be answering those questions as we go. All right, so just a couple more housekeeping items before we get started. So after each session, we will be sending out a follow-up email that will include a recording of the session, some important links to training and instructions, as well as the next steps that you can take to prepare for part 3 of this series. And additionally, if by chance you are still new to Umapped, I do want to make sure that you know how to access your complimentary trial. From our website, which is umapped.com, click on Sign Up in the top right, and then complete the trial request form. Once your trial account has been set up, a member of our customer success team will send you a confirmation email with your account credentials and login instructions. So with that, let's actually get started. So the first thing I want to talk about today is what are vendor profiles and the vendor database. To begin with, we're going to go back to the fundamentals and explain what vendor profiles are and what your vendor database even is. So, a vendor profile, which I have open right now, is where important vendor information is saved. For example, contact information, descriptions, if you have any, and even images, as well as the address information and anything like that. It's important to note that we use the term vendor as a general term that can include hotels, cruises, tour or activity partners, transportation companies, and even airlines and airports. You can see from this list right here that I've clicked on from the filters. The ability to save vendor information in the form of a profile, this drawer right here showing that, means that you do not have to add vendor details time and time again into your templates and trips. Information you add is saved and available for reuse to help save time and eliminate data and information re-entry. All right, so let's go back to here. Your vendor database, which I'm just going to get to by clicking on vendors accommodation, is the entire collection of profiles in your trip publisher account. This database is preloaded with hundreds of thousands of profiles that we have consolidated from various sources over time. These are primarily hotel, cruise, airport, and airline profiles. So what does this mean for you? Profiles for all major hotel chains and cruise lines, for example, are already available for your account day one. So, let's say Four Seasons, for example. There's a variety here that have already been part of the Umapped public database. Or if I look up cruises and I just maybe look up Norwegian, these are all part of the system, the Umapped public database as well. These profiles from the default or public database can be customized and enhanced based on your preferences. And plus, you can always create new vendor profiles if something isn't available in this database. Okay, so now we're going to address using a vendor profile in a template or a trip. So I'm just going to navigate to a trip that I created earlier today, the sample trip to Austria. So to put things into context, let's do a quick demo of how you can incorporate a vendor profile into a trip. So in this example, we'll add a hotel booking for the Hilton Vienna. So I'm just going to click on the add icon and click on accommodation, and I'm going to look up Hilton Vienna. And I think it's that one right there. Voila. So when you're adding a segment into a trip, you might have already noticed that we ask you to type the name of a vendor, in this case a hotel, that various search options appear for you. So as you type, the system searches for a matching vendor profile from the vendor database. If a matching profile is available, such as the one that I just clicked on, and you select it, then all of the information saved in that vendor profile will be added as part of this booking to your trip. I should note that you are not required to select a matching profile. You can always type the name of a vendor without selecting a matching profile, but in this case, no additional information for this vendor will be added to the trip. So let me just redo that and show you again. So if I look up Hilton Vienna, I don't have to choose. Let me just actually close this and restart. So I don't actually have to choose any of these options here. I can also just go straight into choosing the check-in date and create it later on my own if I'd like. For this one, though, I actually do want to choose the one from our vendor database. I'm just going to have it be the 1st until the 9th and add to trip. For most vendor profiles that already exist in the vendor database, you really don't need to do all that much. If you're satisfied with the existing content available, all you have to do is search up the vendor and then add it to your trip. That being said, you can always add more information or remove information based on your preference. We'll talk more about the best ways to edit or create vendor profiles in a few minutes. So let's do one more example of adding a vendor profile into a trip segment. This time I'll add a cruise booking. Reminder that when adding cruises, you start by entering the ship name, and then the sailing month and year, and then click the Find Cruises button. So just as an example, I'm going to look up the Norwegian Epic for October of, let's say actually October of 2020, let's just say. So at this point, all you have to do is pick your cruise itinerary and then the sailing date. So if I wanted to do the Western Mediterranean from Barcelona on the 4th of October, and then scroll down and select import. Cruise profiles are slightly different from other vendor profiles because you have the main cruise profile and information, similar to a hotel profile. And then you also have the day-by-day itinerary for a particular sailing. So I'm gonna not add this to my trip. I just wanted to show that as an example. So I'm just gonna exit that. So there are two different ways to manage and create vendor profiles. First, you can customize and create vendor profiles from the vendor dashboard. So from this screen right here. Or you can customize/create your vendor profiles from within your templates or the trip itself. So let's talk a little bit more, first of all, about option number one. You can customize and create vendor profiles from the vendor database. This is most convenient if you want to customize or create many vendor profiles at once from this main screen right here. If you're new to Umapped, you may want to consider enhancing profiles for your top list of vendors. For example, do you primarily book with certain hotel chains or locations? Take the time to enhance their profiles now, and then you can skip this step later when you go to create templates and trips for your clients. Your most used vendors will already have all of the information available in the trip publisher. So you may also ask, when is the best option to use number two, the best time to use option number two, and customize and create vendor profiles from directly within a trip or a template? So this is the easiest way to enhance or create vendor profiles during the trip building workflow. As you are adding segments to a trip, you can edit a vendor profile from within the trip instead of having to return to the vendor database to make changes. All right, so let's explore a little bit more into option number one, how to edit or create vendor profiles from the vendor database. So let's start with reviewing how to edit or create vendor profiles from this location here. Again, as mentioned, enhancing your most frequently booked vendors all at once is a great way to get all of your ducks in a row. You can afford some time now to help get organized for the future. Once your most booked vendors have comprehensive profiles, you'll be able to create your trips fast and efficiently without having to spend time searching for and adding photos, typing in all the address information, or adding in all of the different websites and social media info. Adding activity or transportation profiles may be a good place to start, since profiles for these types of vendors, activities and transportations, are not part of the public database. So let's start with, this is a hotel that I noticed earlier isn't part of the vendor database. So I'm just going to copy and paste the name of it and then come back to my vendor database. And I'm going to click on the add icon right down here and then select accommodation. So let's go through an example of creating a new vendor profile. So if I wanted to send my travelers to the Schreiner's Essen und Wohnen in Vienna, but I noticed that it isn't part of the vendor database, I can simply add it on my own. I just want to show, first of all, that it isn't part of the database. So I'm just going to add it to the search bar and look for it. And of course, you can see nothing pops up. So that means that it's not part of the database. So I'm going to navigate to the add icon, like I mentioned earlier, and select accommodations. And from there, I will enter Schreiner's Essen und Wohnen in the name field, and then I'm just going to wait for the Google Places listing to pop up. So if you want to quickly add all of the information directly from Google Places, we suggest clicking this listing. Otherwise, you can of course add the address and contact information yourself, but this makes the process much quicker. So I'm just going to click on it, and then I'm going to click Create down here in the bottom right-hand corner. After saving the vendor, you have officially added this hotel to your company's list of vendor profiles. And I can even begin adding my photos now. And all this information has been added. So anytime I go to add the Schreiner's Essen und Wohnen in the future, all of this information will pull up. So once again, the benefit of adding an accommodation or an activity or any other type of segment as a vendor is that if you plan on using that particular vendor again in the future, whether because you've booked with them in the past and you have a good relationship with this company, or because your clients raved about the company after their trip and you want to keep using them in the future, you'll be able to easily call the vendor up when creating your trips. This saves you time and effort when you're building your trips, as you'll only need to add your traveler's specific information. So I'm just going to quickly go back to my main trip, and then I'm just going to close this and come down to the segment that I added earlier for the Schreiner's Essen Wohnen, and I'm going to click View Details. And I'm going to click on the pencil icon and just remove the name for the hotel and re-add it. So you can see that it now appears as part of my company database with two little asterisks, which indicate that it's part of my personal company vendors. So I'm just going to click it to match all of the information from the vendor, and then I'm just going to update. So there you go. I just updated it with the information from the vendor that I just created. So that's just a little neat tip if you ever already created the booking within a trip, but then you had created the vendor within the vendor database itself. You can always match them later on. So now let's take a look at updating or creating vendors from within a trip itself, like this one right here. Once again, this is the most useful if you're currently in the midst of creating a trip and you have a vendor that you'd like to save, or if you know of a past trip with a vendor that you'd like to reuse again in the future. So if you wanted to edit or create a vendor profile for a booking segment that you've already created within a trip, select View Details on the segment in question and click the camera icon. As I mentioned earlier, you do not have to add a vendor every single time that you create a segment, but if you plan on using it again for another trip, or you want to customize it by adding photos, we recommend saving as a vendor, so this can save you time in the future. The vendor must be created in order to add photos to these segments, and this includes, just as I'm doing right now, activity segments, even though there might not be a specific address associated with an activity. But that's perfectly okay. As you can see right here, the only mandatory information for a vendor is the vendor name. So once the vendor profile is added, you can then manage and add your photos. So I don't actually need to add any kind of address, or if I don't want, I don't even have to add any contact or description information. I can just leave this as the guided mountain hiking in Austria and click Save. And now if I hover over the camera icon again, you'll notice that instead of saying create, it now says photos. So this is where I can begin to add my photos. So of course, like you could see earlier, after selecting the camera icon, I was automatically prompted to add the vendor. So what I'm going to do this time is I'm just going to add a new segment. I'm just going to say private tour. I just want to show this again just so that it's perfectly clear. So I'm going to click on activity. I'm going to call this private tour of Vienna. And I'm just going to give this a start date of the 10th, or no, even earlier. Let's say the 2nd. And then click Add to Trip. So again, I'm going to click on that camera icon, and it's prompting me to add the vendor. And of course, I'm going to go ahead and go to the address, and then if I put in a particular location in the landmark name, such as Joseph Vienna maybe, I can click this listing from Google Places to auto-populate the information from Google Places for most relevant fields. If Google Places can't find the vendor, the information can always be added manually, but I just want to show that if I click on Vienna, Austria, all of this information down here automatically got updated from Google Places. And this is also just a way that you can keep a more customized name, such as Private Tour of Vienna, and then have the address be something that has nothing to do with the title. So you can even just let the address be the general location. It doesn't have to be a specific like storefront or park or something like that. It can just be all of Vienna, for example. And then I'm just going to click Save to save that. So now that your vendor has been created, you can always edit that vendor later on. It's important to note that when you edit a vendor profile, you are updating the way this vendor's information is displayed in every trip segment the profile is added to. And that means in every trip across your company that the vendor is in. That being said, you can always hide or change a photo or change the order of a photo at the trip segment level, as this does not permanently change the vendor profile. It only changes the vendor's display in that particular trip segment. That's why the Restore Default option down over here allows you to reset the images to match how it is in the vendor profile. Although we're going to talk about photos a little bit later on. Now that we have shown you how to create and edit your vendors, I just want to quickly clarify by going to vendors what the difference is between a system vendor and your company vendor, which will have your company name right here. You might have noticed this while we were looking at various vendor profiles in the vendor database. So essentially, the label system vendors refers to the fact that this vendor came as part of the Umapped public or default database. The vendors that read your company name, so for instance, my company name is Demo Travel Company, are ones that you've edited or created. To further clarify, just because a vendor is part of the public database, such as this one right here, that doesn't mean that you can't make your own edits to it. We actually encourage you to add new photos, add more details, and really make it your own. For example, maybe you'd like to add a brief description of each hotel you book your clients with, like right down here in the description field, and save it in the vendor profile. The idea is leveraging the database that is available. The idea is to leverage the database that is available to you by default and then customize and enhance it as you see fit. So when you edit the system vendor profile, and this includes information, address, contact information, or photos, then the vendor profile essentially duplicates in the platform, meaning that while the vendor will now be added to your company vendors, other trip publisher users outside of your company will still have access to the system vendor. So the updates you have made will now appear as a new company vendor. So just as a very quick example, I will actually add a brief description for the Albuquerque Marriott by clicking on the pencil icon, coming to contact and description, and I'm just going to write, "This is my description." And then I'm going to save that. And then you can see right over here, the company actually just switched from system to demo travel company, which is my company. So while other people and other companies will still be able to use the Albuquerque Marriott that's available in the system vendors, the Umapped database that is, mine now is customized by myself. So it belongs to my company. Okay. So while many of the hotel and cruise profiles available to you in the vendor database already include photos, there are cases where you will want to add images where they may be missing, such as this one right here that I had earlier, or as you create your own unique profiles. Including images and trips creates a very visual experience for your clients. You can see here I have quite a number in this one. And adding photos to trip segments is one of the great ways to include additional photos. As you might have guessed, you can add photos to a vendor profile from either the vendor tab or from within the trip itself. So we're going to start by adding a vendor from the vendor tab. I'm just going to create a brand new vendor, an activity. So for this example, I'm going to add the Schmetterling house in Vienna, Austria. So I'm just gonna click on the Google Places listing just so that I don't have to deal with all of that address myself and click create. So this is the Imperial Butterfly Park in Vienna. So now I'm going to add an assortment of photos for my clients to later peruse. So I'm gonna click on add photo. And like always, you have those 3 different options for adding a photo. The first is by searching the image library. So this is a free library of licensed images that is available to all users. The second is searching the web using a keyword and a URL. Or of course, you can always upload your own photo if you have a photo on your desktop that you want to use. We typically advise using the first 2 options if you're adding a more generic photo of a location. Most hotels and activities will probably not be included in the Umapped image library. So we recommend adding general photos using the image library. So if I just wanted a photo of Austria itself, so I'll just write Austria. I can show you, but if I looked up Schmetterling, it probably wouldn't be there. Schmetterling house. Oh, there's actually kind of a few. Never mind about that. This one is included in the Wikimedia image library, so I'm just going to go for that. There we go. Oh, that's really nice, actually. And then I'll just add a new photo. If you're looking to add a photo using the search web function, you may need to experiment a bit with adding a photo. I find users often reach out to me saying that the search web function isn't working and that they weren't able to find the photo that they're looking for. And that's usually because, depending on the website's embedded security features, we might not actually be able to pull in or upload images. Now, earlier when I was looking for a website that would let me add a photo, I stumbled across this one. So I'm just going to pull it up. So now the website itself wouldn't let me isolate the picture, but if I right click on this image and I open the image in a new tab, let's just get that new tab, then I can use this URL actually, right up here. I would recommend doing this if you're able to open the image in a separate tab, as that typically works. So I'm just going to go back to my profile right here. And then I'm going to put that in the website URL search. And then additionally, since a keyword is required when you're searching the web, but there isn't really a keyword on this image, what I'm going to do instead is just add a space in the keyword field, just a single space. And there we go. And that will pull it up. So that's just a little tip if there isn't a keyword associated. You can just put a space and that fills the requirements of having something in the keyword field. So I'm going to upload that. And then, of course, my biggest recommendation when adding very specific photos of like hotels or places would be to save the photo to your desktop and then just upload it using that third option right there. So I'm just going to Looking Smart, Butterfly House. There we go. And now I have a bunch of photos for this vendor. And I can add even more. So after you've added your photos, there are a variety of ways to present your photos in the optimal way. So to do so, I'm first just going to go back to my trip, sample trip to Austria, and I'm going to add Schmetterling House as a activity segment. There we go, and it has those two little asterisks to indicate that it's part of my company vendors. So I'm just going to give it a date, let's say the 11th, and then add to trip. And now I'm going to click on the camera icon at the top of the vendor so that I can get to my edit photo screen. So of course there are a variety of different things I can do here. The first toggle by default is going to show photos, but if I toggle that to the left, you can see behind here all of those photos just disappeared. But I prefer to keep my photos on, so I'm just going to keep that toggled to the right. By default, this second toggle over here, which is called Hide Photo Mode, allows me to select a photo and then click on Hide down here at the bottom, just to hide that particular photo from this iteration of the vendor. Of course, I can always bring it back to normal by clicking on Restore Default. And then finally, if I toggle Hide Photo Mode to the right, I can actually reorder my photos. So I can put them in a new order, for example. And again, if I click Restore Default, it's just going to reorganize the photos into what's actually in the vendor profile. If you add a photo from a segment, you are updating this vendor in every single segment in every trip across your company that the vendor is in. That's why if you have to permanently delete a photo for a particular vendor, you can only do so by going back to your vendors. Let's just look up Schmetterling House again. Click on View Details, select the photos, and then click on Edit Photos. And this is where you can actually permanently delete a photo. So if you do want to permanently delete a photo for a particular vendor, you have to do so from the Vendors tab, as this will affect every iteration of the vendor across your trips. So if I go back to my trip itself and go back to that segment for Schmetterling House, right here. Once again, when you edit the photo in a segment, such as hiding a particular photo like that, this does not change the vendor profile. It only changes that specific iteration of the vendor, just to make sure that you don't accidentally delete a photo on user error. So if there is a photo that you've included as part of the vendor, but you don't want to display that photo for a particular trip, you can always choose to hide the photo rather than permanently deleting it. This gives you a little more flexibility in choosing what to showcase to each individual client, as particularly maybe for hotels. For example, if the accommodation vendor includes photos of a deluxe suite or something, but your clients are booked in another kind of room, you might want to hide just those photos of the room to ensure that your clients aren't confused, but without deleting those photos for future clients. Okay, so now we've talked about, I think, the majority of things pertaining to vendors. So I'm just going to get to my last segment here, which is a little explanation of the one-time vendor upload. So for any of those of you who have a database of your own vendor profiles that you've collected or created over time, so perhaps saved in another system or in your CRM, we offer a one-time upload of all of your vendor profiles. This will upload all of the information that you've collected, into the trip publisher in one shot. There is a particular format in which we need to receive your vendor information in order to perform this upload. And we should also note that this is done at the company level. So if your company does have a list of preferred vendors, please reach out to us following this webinar at support@umapped.com to learn a little bit more about this process. Okay, so over the course of this webinar, we've looked at how you can leverage the Umapped public database for vendors and how to create new vendor profiles, and then add content, descriptions, and photos to your vendor profiles. And we've also demonstrated how you can use your vendor profiles to customize your trips, and how to edit vendor profiles from the vendors tab versus from within your trip, as well as the circumstances necessitating each option. So at this point, we'll move on to the live Q&A portion of the webinar. And I would also like to encourage everyone not just to ask questions about what you've seen during this webinar, but anything that you have questions about in general. For anybody that can't stay for the Q&A, I just wanted to say thank you for participating in today's webinar. As I mentioned, I will be sending out a follow-up email with a link to a recording and some extra information, as well as more information on the one-time vendor upload. So I'm just going to have a quick sip of water, and then I'm going to answer some questions. Okay. So Estefania asked what the vendor tags are for, and I imagine you mean these tags right here. So much like the tags on a trip, this is just an additional way that you can search up a particular vendor. You can add maybe a location here, maybe the city that the Arizona Biltmore is located in, just so that if you're looking up for things later on using the search function up here, you can locate that vendor using more than just the vendor name, if you know what I mean. That way, if there's, you're thinking, okay, what do I have in Tokyo, Japan, or what do I have in Vienna, Austria? But maybe the name Vienna or Austria doesn't appear in the activity segment or in the hotel segment. If you add those information, those little like keywords into the tags, then you can always search for them later on. Patricia asked if there's a recording. I'll send Patricia Wilcock. I can send you a recording of last week's class following this webinar. Deborah Barnes asked, can you also create vendors for restaurants for when we get dinner reservations? So absolutely, this is definitely something you can add as a vendor. So all of this is contained within activity segments, because if I go into sample trip to Austria, for example, and I use the add icon and select activity, you'll notice that when I click on type, there's a bunch of different kinds of activity types. So I can choose restaurant, I can choose event, I can even choose a day tour or something like that. So I'm gonna click on restaurant. I'm just gonna quickly look up a restaurant in Vienna, just to have an example. Let's just do this one. And that's where I live. Let's do this one right here. I'm just going to take the name and then put that here. And then I'll just choose a date, the 4th, and then it's added. And now if I want to save this restaurant for future bookings, again, just like I did earlier with the other activities, I'm going to click on the camera icon, and that's going to prompt me to add the vendor. And of course, if I just click on the name, that information from Google Places will automatically pop up. So I can click that, and then voila, the address and the contact information already has stuff directly from Google Places. So I skip over having to do any of that myself. And then I can just click save. And if I go look for it later in the vendors, it's right there, saved and ready to use whenever I want in the future. And I can add any photos I'd like. Okay, so I noticed there's a couple different places, a couple different people asking for a recording of last week's webinar. I absolutely can do that. I'm just going to write down your names really quick, and I'll reach out to you. 1 second. Mm. Anyone else, just you can always send us an email at support@umapped.com. I have all of the recordings, so I can easily send them off in just a couple of seconds to anybody that needs them. Um, Oh, Pauline wants to know, what do you put in the label field of the vendor? So 1 second. I'm going to assume you mean when you're creating a segment, because there doesn't seem to be a label place anywhere except when I'm adding an activity. So right there, this section right here. So this can just give a little bit more context to whatever it is that you're adding as an activity or as like a transportation segment or something. So for example, if I was adding a restaurant, right here in the name field, I could write the actual name of the restaurant. So I could write Sophie's Cafe, for instance. But in the label field, I could make this a little bit more specific. So I could say brunch reservation. And then I'll just put those two little, the colon, just so that I can say that this Sophie's Cafe is a brunch reservation. And then I'll just add that to my trip. And I'm just gonna publish this really quickly so you can see what that looks like on the client's view. Web view. Just gonna put my email in. And oh, I didn't even need to add the colon myself, but there we go. So that's where the label goes, right there. And then that's the name of whatever the activity or the transportation segment or what have you is. So the label essentially just provides a little bit more context for whatever it is that you've booked. Okay, so Rolanda asked, and this has to do with templates, but we can make a quick divergence, no problem. So she asked, for templates, can we add dates? So it's because templates are supposed to be a model of a trip that you can then create a trip from later on. They don't actually have specific dates. All templates just have a duration. Because they kind of exist in perpetuity, if that makes any sense. They never have a past, they're never past dated, they're never future dated. The adventure in France will always be available to me so that when I do create a trip from this, let's create a trip. I'll call it Adventure in France. And then I pick a start date. So I'm gonna pick August 1st as my start date just to show you what happens when you do this. So I'm going to click on the first, create a trip for my template, and then it's exactly 14 days. And everything within the template, so if something falls on day 2, it'll go on August 2nd, because that's the day 2 of the trip, you know, if that makes sense. Okay. Michael asked, can I have one vendor with many different activities? Each activity would be its own vendor. Maybe let me make that a little bit more clear. I'm just going to filter by activity. So there isn't a way to make one vendor that contains different activities. The vendor is itself the activity segment. So let's look up something I made earlier today, which was votive Kirsch. So I made this earlier today. This actually is an activity segment right here. So it only contains the information about votive Kirsch, and it has photos of that. So I can add this to a trip later on if I send my travelers to this medieval church, but it doesn't contain multiple activities within it. So each vendor, like this, is its own segment, not like an overall vendor. I'm just going to write down a couple more names. Kristen Carper, So Adina asked, actually, this is a pretty good question because it has to do with photos. So Adina asked, you answered that the size of the uploaded images doesn't matter. Does the program resize it itself? What is the ideal image size? We've noticed that sometimes loading takes longer with larger images. The size of the uploaded images actually does matter. For one, I will say that. If you upload a photo that's the size of a thumbnail, if you notice, let me actually go into the web itinerary for, oh, not this trip. Let's go into the one that I just created. So sample trip to Austria. Open the web view. So photos are typically about this big. Off the top of my head, I want to say this is something like 500 by 600 pixels or something like that. I can do a little bit more and send that out, a little more research and send that the specific picture size information out to everybody. But this is the standard size for all of images. So if you upload a photo that's the size of a thumbnail, just a little tiny thing, it will stretch to this size and that will look really distorted. So I'm gonna say that if you're adding photos, try to make them about 500 by 600 pixels or something like that. But I'll find out the exact size and send that out. But if you ever need to reference, just go to the trip publisher and go into a trip you've published and find the web view and just scroll through some of the photos that you've added. You can see that the size here and for the tour of Hofburg is the exact same size as that of Hilton Vienna. So the program will resize photos if they're really small or absurdly large to about this size. But you can also always edit photos of your own on your computer if you ever have a photo that's a little too large. I would say just use Preview or something and you can always make it smaller. Deborah asked, if you had a vendor who offered multiple tours, you would file that by what is being visited, not the vendor. So Deborah, in this case, that's a really good question. And actually, that's exactly what I would do. So if you have a particular vendor that has multiple different tours that are offered, I would say to save each of those tours as an activity vendor. So this could be, you can even specify who the company is. So this could be Sophie's company, and then say a tour of Austria, or half day tour, I should say. I want to do something a little specific, and then create that. And that way it's specified here who the company is and then what the actual tour itself is. And I can fill out all of the address information and the contact description information, and then add photos of that particular tour. So that's what I would recommend for if you're adding tours that come from a specific supplier or tour operator. Okay, let's see, anything more? Nick asked, how often are the vendor profiles updated? I don't know off the top of my head, so I can find that out and send you the information later, Nick. But they are updated on a semi-regular basis. But I'll find out more about that. I just don't know off the top of my head. All right, let's see. There's more questions. I noticed some people are asking in the chat, so I just want to make sure that I didn't miss anything. Okay, so Kelly asked, for all of my COVID cancels, can I delete the trip and be able to reference later when they hopefully rebook? So this is actually a really good opportunity for you to use templates. I know this is getting a little ahead because templates is going to be one of our sessions later on, but if you have a trip that was previously booked but it got canceled, my biggest recommendation really would be to click on the little options icon on the published trip and click create a new template from that trip. So I'm going to do sample template to Austria, and then I'm going to create that. That way it's saved in your templates, and of course you can always delete now this trip right here, if you'd like, because it is saved in your templates. But I would really, really strongly advise you don't delete a trip. Like, don't delete this trip if you plan on using it again in the future, as it takes us a little bit of time to recover deleted trips. So just for your own, ease of mind, I would say either leave it here, because you can always find your past trips later on by clicking on the filters icon and then sorting by date and clicking on past. That's all of your past trips right there. So you can always, go in, change the date on the trip. I'll just show you a really quick example. You can always change the date right here by just going to the trip, clicking on the pencil icon, and then updating the dates. So if it's a year from now or a couple months from now, you'll still find it in your past trips and you can update it. Or you can just save it as a template and then you can, have it start on whatever date in the future. But I would strongly advise don't delete it altogether. Okay, I'm just going to answer maybe one more question, because I do have the intro webinar right after this. So I want to make sure that I still have time to prepare for the intro. Okay, so this is a really awesome question from Judy. I actually probably should have mentioned this during the presentation itself. It slipped my mind, but she asked, will the vendor information automatically populate the itinerary from client base? So this is a really great question for people that are creating their trips in systems like Travel Contact, or they're creating them, the bookings in client base or something like that, and then they're importing those bookings into the trip publisher. So if the name, I'm going to go to my vendors, sorry. Just let that open. So if in client base, the name of the hotel is Arizona Biltmore, a Waldorf Astoria resort, or whatever the accommodation is, and I also have that saved in my vendors, then those two bookings will match when I import it from client base. But the name has to be exactly the same. So in client base, the name of the hotel has to be Arizona Biltmore, comma, a Waldorf Astoria resort, or something very similar. I'm not sure if the comma is actually necessary or not, but it has to be this exact wording for it to match to this vendor profile when you're importing it into the trip publisher. And then if it is the same, it will match, and all of the photos and address information will automatically be uploaded, will be added, I should say, to the booking in your trip. But like I mentioned, the name has to be the same. If the name in client base is just Arizona Biltmore, it probably won't match. Or if it's something different, like just Waldorf Astoria, Arizona Biltmore, or something like that, and it's just a little off, it'll be just different enough that the platform won't recognize that it's the same hotel and match them. So just be careful about the name that you're using in client base or in Travel Contact when you're importing it. But at the end of the day, I'm going to give you guys a quick example. If, let's say, I imported, let me find something. Okay, you know what? I'm going to use this because I made it earlier and I didn't do anything with it. So I'm just going to delete it and show you what would happen if you imported a segment from client base or from Travel Contact and the name was slightly different. So let's say I had something like that. I don't know. I just don't want it to pop up. Let's say and. I'm just going to add it. Pretend like it came in like this. So let's say you imported this from client base and it was just different enough that it didn't match to the Shriners Essen und Wohnen that's part of my vendor profile, my saved vendor profiles. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly click on the pencil icon and I'm just going to update the name. And then click on this option that just popped up. So now all of the information that was in my vendor just got refreshed right here. So if something ever comes in from client base or comes in from Travel Contact or something, and it didn't match with the vendor that's in your vendor database, you can always just update the name really quickly and choose the option that populates. And you can tell it's one of yours by those two asterisks that I mentioned earlier. And then everything will update. So that's just one way of kind of circumventing if you've imported something that didn't get matched up to the vendor in your vendor database. Okay, so I noticed that there are still a lot of questions. These are all being saved, but I do have to jump on to another webinar, so I'm going to sign off now. I just wanted to say thank you, everybody, for your participation and all your great questions. They are being saved, so it may take me a little bit of time, but I will reach out to all of you later on about your questions, and we are going to send a follow-up with a recording of this webinar. So don't worry, if I didn't answer your question now, I can always get to it later on. And you can always also book a one-on-one with me by going to umapped.com and clicking on webinars and choosing a time from the one-on-one meeting slots right here, if you ever just need 30 minutes to go over any specific questions. All right, so I'm just gonna sign off. And again, thank you everybody for joining and all of your questions, and have a great rest of your day. Take care. And we'll see you next week for part 3.